Good evening. I'm Kate Mahoney, the Executive Director of the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute for Mental Health Education at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. I'm really honored tonight to have with us Dr. Obari Cartman, who's the president of the Chicago Association of Black Psychologists. And really here to talk about some really critical issues. And I think one of the first things some people have been asking us is, what can parents do more to help raise resilient children? Some strategies for parents.
One of the things that we encourage with this organization, the Black Psychologists, is to start with helping young people understand a foundation around culture and identity that I think helps with a sense of connection to a history and legacy that's full of strength and power, and that the resilience can come out of a firm sense of self that is rooted in understanding Black history, African history, understanding that that our families come from a long history of folks that have been through struggle and have overcome and have found ways to survive, and that we're in a moment now where we have opportunities based on sacrifices that people have made, but also continued struggle that we are facing, and that we understand we have to prepare our young people to be in a world where they might not always be met with value of who they are, based on their skin color, based on where they live, based on their economic status. And because of that, parents have an obligation to firm up the foundation in the house so that there is no question about their child's value, their worth, what they deserve, and that as they bump into a world where things might not always be fair, where their sense of self might not always be affirmed by the TV, by the school, by all the systems that they're and interact with, that the families have an enhanced responsibility to give that to them. And that is the foundation of what resilience means. And resilience really is a concept that speaks to a person's ability to bounce back when faced against obstacles. And so part of the task of building resilient children is to give them that kind of confidence and well-beingness, but also to be aware that the obstacles, the things that we're bouncing them against don't have to be there. So these systems and structures, the things that they have to be resilient against, we should not understand as just how the world must always exist. And so there's another challenge embedded in that, in creating opportunities and reshifting the conditions and the systems and the communities and schools that the children live in that don't always have them faced against struggle. And so there's two layers to that.
That seems like such a great message about really looking at strengths and looking at from a cultural perspective and a culture of people that have faced so many struggles, certainly in this country.
Right.
And have really come through and with some incredible strengths. And so sometimes I think that can get lost in the conversation and more mainstream psychology or thoughts. And so the idea that what you're really trying to do is say, we need to focus as a family, we need to focus as a culture on helping young people realize what the opportunities are, what their challenges are, but that rich history.
Absolutely.
Rich history of strength, of overcoming, of
Absolutely.
moving forward in spite of incredible obstacles, prejudice, discrimination.
Yeah, and I think that we do a disservice to our children and our families when the lens of that resilience is starts with slavery in this country. And so part of what it means to have a more holistic, comprehensive sense of self includes looking at the connections to what African and Black people have endured and have created, and that strength that comes from the beginning of human history, that science now confirms that all people come from this place that we have a direct connection to. And studying the ancient civilizations from Ethiopia to Kush to all over the continent, East and West and South Africa, there's new evidence that we're digging up to suggest that African people created the first of all the things, the math, sciences, civilizations, universities. And if Black children are descendants of slaves and not descendants of kingdom builders, then there's that becomes another skewed perspective about what the strength that we have access to, and it's not just be about struggle and overcome and what we've been through, what somebody else has done to us, but centering that sense of self and worth in a larger history of accomplishment and strength and power.
That sounds really powerful. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of us recognize that in our traditional educational systems, we don't always teach that full history. Sometimes we don't even really teach as far back as really all the intricacies related to slavery, but let alone, really thousands of years prior to that. So are there resources that you think that families can tap into, parents who want to make sure that their children realize the rich history and the rich foundation upon which, they've come, what their background is, that are easily accessible for parents to?
I think that the thing about access now is we're in a world where everything's easily accessible. And so part of the shift in parenting and the strength base and the long view of history begins with a perspective shift where you could have the libraries that are free or internet that's in your pocket accessible to you, but if you're not thinking, how can I go study ancient African civilizations as a part of the well-being of my children, if that's not a priority for you as a value system, then you could have, it could be literally at your fingertips and it not be readily available.
But you're not accessing it.
So if you want to, we're in a world now where if you want to find it, learn about it, it's right there. And so in Chicago, there are several old institutions that are African-centered that have been teaching about history and culture and well-being and humanness for a very long time. I grew up in a school, it was called New Concept Development Center then. It's now a charter school called Betty Shabazz and Barbara Sizemore, and they specialize in that very question. What does it mean to incorporate African cultural heritage into the pedagogy, into the curriculum, and not just be about reading, math, and arithmetic, but it being about centering self from a view that is holistic and accurate, really. It's not even about myth-making. It's really about digging up the truth about what we've done and what that has to do with what you can do now.
So delving deeper, so it sounds like there are some ways, and certainly some schools, where parents, if they're able to enroll their children in certain schools, that there is more some Afrocentric curricula.
Absolutely.
But that if instead somebody's sending their child to a neighborhood school where that may or may not be taking place, that you think it's relatively accessible for parents to be able to incorporate that into family discussion?
I know recently there was some documentaries about the first African civilizations. There's a lot of content. There's good stuff on Netflix. There's stuff on YouTube. Like if you just YouTube African history, right, you can be there for hours just watching lectures and documentaries. If you want to find specific time periods, if you want to study up on ancient Egyptians or Kemetic specifically, if you want to know more about West Africa, just find out what were some of the names of those kingdoms, plug them in, and there's a wealth of information available.
Wonderful.
We just have to go find it.
And then sort of at the other end of the spectrum, so we started out talking about resilience, but one of the things at the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute, we do a lot of work on trying to address the issue that there's a lot of stigma that interferes with when somebody is experiencing a psychological or psychiatric issue. Some of the things that get in the way of people being able to access services or support that can include just lack of financial access, lack of access of not having services anywhere reasonably close to you geographically, and then the other issue about sometimes feeling like people seeing that accessing help as a sign of either weakness or that maybe they're not sure that they believe that psychology really works. So what is your advice to families who maybe do have somebody who could benefit from some services but who are not sure, who don't like to trust people outside their family structure, sort of keep your family business in the family, or look almost exclusively maybe to a spiritual resource? What do you think about that in terms of how, as a psychologist, how to maybe just open the doors a little bit more?
I think that there are some things that families can do to figure out what issues can't be solved by the preacher or minister, and begin to have conversations about not keeping those secrets inside the house that are hurting us, that are hurting our communities. And I think there are some responsibility and some movement in the Black community on at least having conversations about the stigma and starting to be more vulnerable publicly and to create spaces within our communities to have sort of panels or discussions about insecurities or vulnerabilities in mental health. I've been seeing that happen more and more often, and I think that is a good thing. Simultaneously, I think there's a responsibility on mental health providers and the healthcare system to acknowledge that some of the resistance to seeking help from some of these institutions is a healthy mistrust, and that as we're talking about the obstacles and the history of the systems that have been in place to impede wealth and success for Black communities, that some of that has included the healthcare system. And so
Absolutely.
I meet a lot of young, but not young old people that are aware of the Tuskegee syphilis kind of experience.
Certainly,
right?
certainly.
And that
Gives you good reason to be mistrustful.
Right. And so this idea that if I tell all my business to the wrong person, that it might set me up to get in trouble. You might be trying to get in the way of resources. And so there's a lot of what I think is a healthy distrust of some of these systems that needs to mean the schools, the hospitals need to be thinking more about cultural competency, and not in a way that's like a buzzword and not cool, but like really get into the depth of the training of therapists and mental health workers. That, you know, I went to a lot of school, you know, for psychology, and in school I learned a lot about Freud and Skinner and Wilhelm Wundt, and I got a bunch of old white men in my head. Right. And so that is my training as a Black person in the system, and if I go into my communities only knowing white theories, then I could be doing a disservice to them. And so part of it needs to be a shift in the whole culture of how we think about help and healing and psychology at its root, and that has to incorporate culture much more fundamentally than it does.
So Dr. Cartman, I hate to interrupt because this is a really important issue, but we also have a caller.
Okay.
So if it's okay, we'd like to hear from our caller and see if, your response. So caller, we're ready for you. What's your question?
So I wanted to ask the guest about something he said a few moments ago. He said that he thought that Black parents did their children a disservice by sort of starting the teaching of Black history with slavery, and I was curious to know specifically what disservice he thought that did.
If you only think that Blackness began with slavery, then any sign of progress will look like heaven to you. And my comparison to what Black people can achieve is not better than slavery. It's compared to thousands of years of independent living on the continent of Africa.
And leadership and innovation.
Innovation, science, math, all the things that we've considered to be successful, we have a foundation of implementing, of studying, of rise and falls, and I think that beginning with slavery is such a narrow view of what it means to be Black or African, and that particular time period was completely defined by someone else's dominance over us. And if you start with being a victim, and if you start with trauma, and if you start with suffering, then that beginning of a lens of what it means to be Black means that there's a lot of shame attached to that. And so part of what we're talking about in terms of power and resilience is teaching power and pride. And we have a wealth of resources in terms of history and accomplishments that can instill power and pride in a way that I think slavery instills shame and avoidance. And so I don't say avoid slavery. I think it's an important part of our history, but I think starting there misses so much power that our children need to have access to.
That's like starting in the middle of the book as opposed to going back to the beginning and the origins of the history of...
It's like starting at the worst part of the book.
Right.
Not even just randomly in the middle, but starting right at the nightmare and then building back from there, then, I mean, it misses too much for me.
Caller, do you have more to say or ask about that?
No, I thought that was very good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for calling. So a moment ago before, and that was a really I think, insightful call as well to just kind of clarify that. But you were talking a little bit about providers and how providers, psychologists, maybe also the more traditional medical community, psychiatrists, physicians, clinical social workers are trained. And one of my questions is, many people want to see if they're going to see a therapist, they'd like to see somebody who looks kind of like them, whether it be gender or race or whatever. Do you feel like we have enough Black psychologists and clinical social workers and psychiatrists, or should we be doing more to recruit more people to this specialty?
I've two answers. One, no, there aren't enough. There are many more Black and brown people that need services than the number of counselors that can meet those needs, for sure. In the meantime, what that means is finding ways for the schools to recruit more students into the social sciences. It means making the training applicable to the kind of work that the communities need. And it means finding ways to take the skills of the counselors and therapists into the communities where people that are naturally interfacing with the community can have a different set of skills and perspectives and knowledge sets. So we're talking barbers, we're talking ministers again, teachers. We're talking about making sure that everyone has at least a clearer baseline about how trauma impacts every day, what are some sort of basic coping skills and ways to be able to tap into what are naturally already like organic healing opportunities in communities that don't have to require having a professional come in or going to sit in somebody's office, but like just instilling in the day-to-day of our everydays. What are some things that we can do more, do better, that are healing, that are kind, that are appropriate responses to the pain and the struggle that we see that need to be incorporated more efficiently into the community it is.
Fabulous. I think that really sounds a lot like some strategies that can work at multiple levels. That if people are more, if we train community members to understand mental health issues, mental wellness, they can be advocates and partners and leaders in promoting mental wellness, helping people develop skills. And then if we can also teach folks that it's positive to go and get help when you need help, in the same way that it's positive to be proactive about your physical health, to go for immunizations, annual checkups, getting blood work done, etc., that this is another way people can take good care of themselves so that they can continue to be active, engaged members of their own communities. So that sounds very positive in terms of that. If people are looking for services, and somebody wants a culturally competent therapist who they think would be understand the experience of growing up in being African American in a city like Chicago, are there some resources that you might recommend if people are looking for help?
There are not a lot. My organization, the Chicago Association of Black Psychologists, we have monthly meetings. And we have partnered with a couple of different other organizations in Chicago, the Association of Black Social Workers, Sister Afia, who put on the Black Mental Wellness Weekend last weekend. There's an organization called Camp Community of African American Mental Health Professionals, and a committee within the Black Lives Matter movement called sort of like a wellness committee that are collaborating to create a directory of Black mental health professionals. Just to meet that specific need. I get calls for referrals all the time, and it's hard to know who to send people to, who's working, who takes insurance, who's doing what specialties people have.
Right.
And so we're compiling that right now, and shortly by the end of the year, hopefully we should have the beginning of a website
Great.
that has a listing of therapists.
Well, I know at the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute, we'd love to link to that. We have some phenomenal Black psychologists at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, many of who both practice and then teach. But my sense is we don't have enough providers. One of the struggles, it feels to me, is making services accessible in the community. And of course, many mental health professionals have struggled in the last couple of years feeling like there's not adequate funding, particularly for individuals who still don't have health care coverage or don't have adequate health care coverage.
Right.
So finding ways that when someone's ready for services and in need of services, we can link them to a provider that they're going to feel comfortable with and that they could get to regularly. I mean, if you're going to see somebody maybe once a week, it needs to be, accessible by public transportation
Right.
or not too much, travel involved.
Right.
It needs to be affordable, and it needs to be a place that's welcoming and somebody feels like, this person gets me, this person can help me. So it's exciting to see the work that you're doing. I loved learning about the conference that you were involved with, I think, just about 10 days ago now. And is the plan for that to be an annual conference? Has it been an annual conference?
Yeah, well, that was the first annual.
First annual,
Right?
I love to
And
hear
so
that.
we're
It's
going to keep doing that every
forward-thinking.
year. But all those organizations will be doing more regular, like, programming, space for conversations, space to meet therapists. And so all those organizations that I named, you find them, link them, email them, like, find us. Like,
Great.
we'll be doing stuff throughout the year, in addition to the annual conference for sure.
And then is part of what you are doing is linking like to the churches, because I find a lot of people do often first talk to a minister when something's happening for themselves or a loved one, so that then our clergy would also be informed about how to help kind of people navigate to
Yeah, I was in a church
psychologist.
last night. Pastor John Hanna's church, they have a youth ministry, like the millennials, I think the 18 to 35-year-olds. And
Fabulous.
we had small group circles, and we're talking about insecurities. And so, I think that is definitely happening more and more, opening the space in church to have that conversation and not just rely on scripture or prayer to deal with things, exclusively to deal with things in terms of
Right.
mental health and illness.
But what's exciting too is at the other end, I think those of us, I'm a clinical social worker, you're a psychologist, that we also have opened up more to also see faith-based leaders as potential partners.
Absolutely.
So it's not one or the other, but that there's, for an individual or family that they might find that we could be sort of a team of people who care about them and can help them kind of navigate some of the challenges. So that's an exciting partnership.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is
And
really
there, as
positive.
many problems as there are, as much pain and suffering as there are, and as many different ways that our communities are under attack, there have to be as many outlets and solutions and teams. Like there has to be teams to fix any of this stuff. And so collaborations, interdisciplinary work is the only way to get any headway in creating healing opportunities for communities.
And it sounds wonderful to me that your leadership in the Chicago Association of Black Psychologists is really about trying to do more, make services more accessible, build an awareness, and so that it doesn't feel like it's psychology or any kind of help is just for one race, culture,
Right.
ethnic group,
Right.
but that it's services should be accessible to all, and that you come from such a wonderful strengths perspective, really looking at, again, at the resilience is very exciting to see. So I would imagine parents could find you as a great resource as they're trying to navigate how they can best help their children move forward, and that anyone really struggling could reach out to you and find somebody who's caring and compassionate that can help them through really difficult times. So
Yeah.
I'm delighted to meet you and to
happy
feel
to
like
meet
there
you
might be
too.
some opportunities that we
Yes.
could collaborate and really try to move forward in the community. So thank you so much for making the time to come out tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.